Unit 2 Economics, Day 2, Borrowing and Loans. What is the objective? What is your learning goal today? By the end of the lesson, you should be able to define interest, give me the definition, and also at the end, be able to predict the effect of raising and lowering interest rates. We'll start where we left off yesterday. There's the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of the United States of America for all intents and purposes, not the brand name, but the actual #1 bank in America. It's also the banker's bank. All of your regional banks get money from somewhere. They get it from the Fed. They borrow from the Fed, or the Fed loans it to the banks. They eventually pay that money back. But first, how they make a profit is they loan that money to firms, which are businesses and stores. They also loan to households, which are the people buying cars, paying for college, buying homes. They loan it to you. You eventually pay them back, and they make a profit. Now, once the money is out in the economy, the Fed to the banks to the firms and the households, the firms and households spend. Firms and households spend money at firms. You go buy stuff at a store. You buy stuff from a car dealership. Firms also have to buy raw resources. Firms may expand and spend that money to build more factories. So businesses spend just like households spend. And as spending increases, those same firms also spend on workers, especially when they expand. As business does well, they hire more workers. That means we have more households also spending, and those households spend at more firms, and it goes up and up and up. So once we get more money in the economy, there's going to be more spending. You just loan it out, let the firms and businesses spend, let the households spend. It creates more firms. More firms means more households working, and as more people are working, there's more spending, and as there's more spending, the firms grow, they hire more workers, more spending, and it goes up and up and up, and the economy grows. So how do we get the money out there? How do we get more money into this system that you see on the screen? Well, you got more loans. Fed does more loans, and if they do more loans, the banks can do more loans. That's more money for firms and households, and more spending. Yay, yay, yay. But how do we get more loans? Low interest rates. We'll explain this in a second. How low interest rates entice or encourage more borrowing, which leads to more spending and firms growing and hiring more workers. So over the basics, we get the idea that more money means more spending. And more spending leads to firms and businesses growing, more workers, the economy grows. Now, yes, inflation is going to be an issue. We'll talk about that later this week. But overall, this more money thing starts with low interest rates on loans. A lower interest rate entices more borrowing. And if people have borrowed more money, they spend that more money. They spend it on firms, the firms grow, the economy grows. Boom, boom, boom. So borrowing, there is interest. And interest, for its basic purpose, is the money paid on top of a loan. You borrow $100 at 6% interest. You pay back that $100 along with 6%, which is $6. So you pay back in total $106. Interest is the amount the money grows over time. It's the money that you pay back. It's how the banks make money loaning money. Households and firms borrow money. You borrow money to buy a house. You borrow money to buy a car. Businesses also borrow money to make big expansions. They borrow money sometimes to make payroll. They borrow money to buy all sorts of things, to buy resources. Chiefs may have to borrow money to pay for their next shipment of milk. They borrow money, they spend that money then goes to the farmer, he spends the money, yay, yay, yay. It all starts with borrowing. So let's look at scenario 1 and scenario 2 and try to understand how interest rates and low interest rates affect the economy. Scenario 1, $100 loan at 9% interest, you pay back $109. Okay, fine. Scenario 2, $100 at 6% interest, you pay back $106. And scenario 2 is cheaper to borrow. And as we know, more borrowing leads to more spending, the economy grows. Here is a real life example. You want to buy a Nissan truck for $30,000. In scenario 1, at the top of the screen, the interest rate is 10% in the top left. And if you look in the middle, so if you borrow $30,000, you pay back that $30,000 along with $8,000 because of the interest. That loan cost you $8,000. Not necessarily cheap. You're paying back $38,000. $8,000 can buy a lot of things, but you don't get it because you're using that $8,000 to pay for the loan. Scenario 2, where we lower interest rates down to 2%, you borrow the $30,000 to buy the truck. You pay back the $30,000, And then it's only another $1,549 on top of that. Significant amount of savings. Almost over $6,000 that you now have in your pocket to spend. In which scenario are you more likely to borrow? Lower interest rates are going to lead to more borrowing. You're more likely to borrow. You may, in the first scenario, say, I just can't afford that. Second scenario, you say, you know what, give me that loan. Now you have spent that $30,000. And that $30,000 is going to find its way through the economy, to firms, to households, and the economy grows. That's how that works. Pretty simple. Low interest rates, more borrowing. If you raise interest rates, people are less likely to borrow. So again, more money, more spending, you got it. We need more loans. How do we get more loans to get this thing jump started? Low interest rates. The Fed sets the interest rates. The Fed loans to the banks. The banks, just like you and me and firms, are more likely to borrow when interest rates are low. If interest rates are high, the regional bank says, I don't want to borrow from you because I can't make profit off this loan. But as the Fed lowers interest rates, the bank says, sure, we'll take that cheap free money, we'll borrow it, and then we'll loan it out to firms and households. And firms and households act in the same manner. You're more likely to borrow that money and take a loan when it's cheap, easy money. You'll take the chance on the loan to pay for whatever it is you need or want. And then you spend that money on firms, and firms spend that money on firms. And that results in more firms being created or more firms expanding. And as the expansion happens and as new firms and businesses are created, more workers are hired. And now we have additional households with money spending, and they may eventually borrow as well if interest rates are low and the economy grows. Yes, inflation looms in the background. We'll talk about that later. But you get the idea that low interest rates jumpstarts this economy. Banks take loans from the Fed, and that's where it jumpstarts. The Fed decides what interest rates will be. They decide how much you have to pay back for a loan. If they make it high, it's harder to borrow, less money, less spending, and you can predict what happens to that economy. When they lower interest rates, banks are more likely to borrow, you're more likely to borrow, the money gets out there, and the economy grows. Fed to the banks, banks to the firms and households. That is generally how your economy works. That's day two. Borrowing and loans, you pretty much have an idea from an individual perspective of how it works if you want to buy your truck, but you also can understand the macro or the big picture economics of if we have thousands and thousands and millions of people borrowing at lower interest rates, the impact it can have on the entire economy. If you get a lot of borrowing, big growth. You got to worry about inflation, which we'll get to in a second. And then you have high interest rates, which slow the economy down.